Hey there, ready for a deep dive into something, well, let's just say it's something that hits close to home for a lot of us.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
We're talking debt today.
Debt? Okay, I'm listening.
And get this, our source material is an English language learning podcast.
Whoa, an English learning podcast, huh? Never would have guessed that's where we'd be going with this.
Right, it's called SmartPodcast, and they actually use this really interesting dialogue-driven episode.
Dialogue-driven?
Yeah, it's about this guy like totally drowning in debt during a recession. It's almost like a mini drama playing out.
Huh. So they're using a story to teach English. That's actually pretty clever.
Yeah, and they weave in all this vocab like recession and broke, but what really hooked me was...
What's that?
Well, it's how they use the story to like really show you the emotional side of debt. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's often overlooked. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers.
Totally. So the main character, his name's Charlie. Yeah, and he's dealing with job loss, mounting bills. Even his son's college tuition is like hanging over his head.
Oof, that's a lot to handle.
Tell me about it. He's got credit card debt, car payments, a mortgage. It's like the whole shebang.
You know, it's funny you mentioned all those different types of debt because I think it reflects a bigger issue we've got.
What's that?
Well, we often lump all debt together, right? But it's important to remember that it comes in so many forms, and each one has its own little quirks.
That's true. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, and in Charlie's case, it's like the recession just pushed him over the edge. You could hear it in his voice when he says, "This recession has hit me pretty hard."
I felt that.
It's heavy stuff, right? And it's not even just about the money, is it?
What do you mean?
Well, there's the emotional cost of debt, too. The constant worry, that feeling of being trapped, the potential strain on relationships. It's a lot to carry.
It really is. And that's where this episode takes this crazy turn.
Oh.
So Charlie decides to go to Mr. Corleone for help.
Hold on, Mr. Corleone, as in like the Mr. Corleone.
The one and only.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking mob boss territory now. This is getting interesting.
Right. And when you think Mr. Corleone, you think power influence, right?
Yeah, you definitely don't think financial struggles.
Exactly. But here's the kicker.
I'm on the edge of my seat.
Even Mr. Corleone is feeling the heat of this recession. He lost a fortune in the stock market crash, and guess what? He's broke, flat out broke.
No way, seriously?
Yeah, he basically tells Charlie to get lost.
Whoa. Wait, so even the mob boss is vulnerable in a recession? That's kind of blowing my mind right now.
It really makes you think, right? Like, does this mean organized crime has a weakness? Are they more reliant on a stable economy than we think?
Huh. I've never considered that before. It's like we assume these illegal activities exist outside the normal rules of business.
Right.
But maybe they're more connected than we realize.
I think it's fascinating, too, to think about this from Mr. Corleone's perspective.
Oh, how so?
Well, this is a guy who's used to being the problem solver, right? People come to him for help.
Yeah.
And now he's the one who's powerless. To have that control ripped away must be a huge psychological blow.
You're right. I hadn't thought of that.
So we've got Charlie crushed under the weight of everyday debt.
Right.
And then you've got Mr. Corleone reeling from this financial hit that's basically turned his world upside down.
Both facing the reality of the recession, but in such different ways.
And it's all happening within this English learning podcast.
It's like a reminder that learning can pop up anywhere, right? Even in the most unexpected places.
Seriously, and that sometimes these seemingly simple situations can spark some pretty deep thoughts.
Totally.
The episode goes on to compare how different cultures view debt, and I found that super fascinating.
Oh, yeah? Like what?
Well, they point out that in some European countries like Switzerland, there's a huge aversion to debt.
Really?
Yeah, but then in North America, it's almost like we're encouraged to take on debt.
Huh. Interesting. It's more than just spending habits, though, isn't it? These attitudes are tied to cultural values, historical context, even the way their financial systems are set up.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, if someone like Charlie was living in Switzerland, would he even be in this mess? Or would the stigma around debt make it even harder for him to ask for help?
Those are good questions. It really highlights how much our culture influences our relationship with money.
Absolutely. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, different types of debt, the mental and emotional toll it takes, even the surprising vulnerability of powerful figures, plus those fascinating cultural differences in how we see debt. What's sticking with you so far?
You know what really gets me is the human element. Like Charlie's story, it's made up for this language lesson.
Yeah.
But it feels so real. It's like a reminder that behind all the economic jargon are actual people struggling with this stuff.
I agree. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, but this episode forces us to see the human cost, the anxiety, the fear, the desperation.
It's a powerful reminder that economics isn't just about charts and graphs. It's about people's lives.
Okay, ready for part 2 of this deep dive?
I am hooked. Let's do it. You know what's really cool about this podcast is how they weave in the whole idea of asking for help.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. It's not just about learning words, it's about learning how to handle these tricky situations.
Right. They focus on phrases like, "What can I do for you?" or "I'm really sorry to trouble you."
Yeah.
Those might seem basic, but they're so important when you're in a vulnerable position.
It's about respecting the other person, making them feel comfortable, right?
Exactly. And it's not just for language learning either.
Where else would you use that?
Well, think about it. Building relationships, having tough conversations, asking for support, it's all connected.
I like how they highlight the phrase "on top of all that." It's something we say all the time, but it really packs a punch.
Doesn't it? Like when Charlie says, "I lost my job, my car broke down, and on top of all that, I'm behind on all my bills."
Man, that just hits you right in the gut.
Yeah, it's like each problem just makes the others feel worse. Do you know what I mean?
Totally. It's not just adding problems. It's like multiplying the stress.
Exactly. And it shows you how these financial struggles can spill over into every part of your life. It's never just about the money.
So we talked about how debt affects us emotionally, but let's zoom out a bit. What about the cultural differences we were discussing?
Oh yeah, good point. It's one thing to say Switzerland is debt averse, but what does that actually look like day to day?
Right. Good question.
The podcast mentioned that you need to put down a deposit to even get a credit card in Switzerland.
Whoa, seriously?
It's like their whole system is built to keep you out of debt.
That's wild. Here in the US, it's like they're throwing credit cards at you the second you graduate high school.
It's a completely different mindset. Makes you wonder if one way is better than the other.
Yeah. Does avoiding debt make people more financially stable? Or does it hold them back from opportunities?
It's tough to say, right? There are definitely pros and cons to both approaches.
Like, on one hand, being cautious with debt could lead to more financial security.
Yeah, but it might also limit people's ability to invest in their future.
And then on the other hand, being more open to debt could fuel the economy.
But it could also lead to people getting in over their heads like Charlie.
It's such a complex issue. This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening, don't you think? We've talked about how debt impacts us emotionally, how language plays a role in these situations, and even how different cultures view debt so differently.
I know, right? And to think it all started with an English learning podcast.
It really shows you that learning can happen anywhere, right?
Absolutely. Keeps things interesting for sure.
Ready to wrap up this exploration with the final part of our deep dive?
Absolutely. Let's go.
So we've heard Charlie's story in this English learning podcast.
Right.
But it leaves us with a big question, like, in a world where even the mob boss is broke,
Yeah.
where do people turn when they're struggling financially?
That's the tough one, isn't it? It used to be family or, certain institutions, but those aren't always there anymore.
Or maybe they're just not enough.
Yeah, and with everything costing more these days and all the economic uncertainty, it feels like more and more people are finding themselves in that boat.
It's a tough reality for sure.
It really makes you think about the importance of financial literacy, don't you think? Like having access to resources and maybe even changing how we view debt and asking for help as a society.
We talked about how different cultures look at debt,
Right.
but I'm wondering how that plays out when it comes to support systems.
Yeah, good question.
Like, would Charlie's story have gone differently in Switzerland? Where they're super debt averse?
That's an interesting thought. Maybe in a culture that avoids debt, there would be more social safety nets or a stronger sense of community support.
Maybe.
But then again, maybe the stigma around debt would make it even harder for someone like Charlie to admit they need help.
It's almost like a catch-22, isn't it? Like, you'd think a culture that avoids debt would be more understanding.
Yeah.
But what if that avoidance comes with a lot of judgment?
Exactly. There's no easy answer. It seems like each culture's got its own pluses and minuses when it comes to dealing with debt, and that impacts how people handle tough times.
I think what's really resonated with me in this deep dive is realizing that there are real people behind all those economic statistics.
I agree.
It's easy to get caught up in the numbers, but Charlie's story, even though it's fictional,
Right.
it reminds us that debt has a real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. While this podcast episode was meant to teach English,
Yeah.
it sparked a conversation that goes way beyond just language.
It's made us think about the emotional burden of debt, the cultural influences, and the whole system of support, or the lack of it in different parts of the world.
And in the end, I think it's a call for empathy and understanding.
What do you mean?
Well, it's a reminder that behind every statistic, every news story about the economy, there are real people going through real struggles.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of debt, let's try to hold on to that empathy.
I like that.
Let's keep asking questions, challenging what we think we know, and looking for solutions that don't just focus on the economics, but also consider the human side of things.
It's been great diving deep with you. It's amazing what you can learn from the most unexpected places.
That's for sure. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious.